Hey there, guys. Can you hear me? Anyone, could you please type something to confirm that we have the connection? All right. So before I start the lecture, and today we're going to talk about corporate governance, I'd like to give an opportunity to you to ask me questions. So I received some emails about final grades and stuff like that. If anyone has any questions, why don't you guys speak up or type your questions, whichever way you prefer. Anything? Anyone? Well, if not, then I guess we'll continue to the lecture. Let me get my slides. So here is the deal. We're talking about corporate governance, and the way we'll do it today is I'll talk about what it generally is. We'll talk about the mechanisms of corporate governance, internal and external. We'll talk about how companies try to protect themselves from some of the external mechanisms of corporate governance. And then we would look at the international issues in corporate governance because the practices we're going to discuss today, they are very common in the West, specifically the United States and most countries in Europe. I would imagine in Russia, they hold just the same. But, there is still some international variation in which mechanisms are used and how effective they are. So we would take a good look at that as well. So first of all, what really is corporate governance? And let me remind you something. So as the companies grow, right? So initially when the company is just being created, you have this original entrepreneur, owner, manager, who basically manages the organization as he or she sees fit, right? So he's the ultimate decision maker. He makes all the key decisions, maybe all the minor decisions as well. And if at some point people get hired, they basically do what that owner tells them to. As the organization grows, it becomes more complicated for just one person to make all the decisions. So you start hiring people who help you with maybe some of your marketing activities, maybe some of the manufacturing activities, if you happen to be a manufacturing business. So depending on what kind of organization, what kind of operations you run, you will have some people who make decisions on your behalf. And this is where issues start arising, because people who you put in a position of power to make decisions on your behalf may or may not have your best interest in mind. And this is still manageable when organization is not overly large, although it is complicated. But as you really grow beyond a certain threshold, owners typically get disengaged from managing day-to-day operations, right? If you think about most major corporations today, people who own them really are not engaged in managing the companies. So you start hiring managers with the decision-making authority. And those managers are supposed to be making decisions in your best interests. And often they do not do that, right? So we have this separation of ownership and management that typically happens as your business scales up. And it is this separation of ownership and management that creates a bunch of complications. So corporate governance is a set of mechanisms that you have to establish order between parties whose interests might be in conflict. So you could easily imagine that, let's say you own a company and there's a CEO who wants a better deal, right? So he may demand certain kind of compensation. He may try to diversify the company. He may try to expand it to certain regions that are of interest to that CEO, but not necessarily to you. So if you recall what we discussed when we talked about executive access and all those value reducing reasons for diversification, this is sort of the common ground. This is where the interest of people who manage your business may not align well with your own interest. So you have to put that mechanism in place, and this is what corporate governance really is, and that mechanism is meant to align their interests with yours. And there are two groups of mechanisms, internal and external. Internal are possibly more important because they give you, as the owner, an opportunity to align those interests. And it's when all the internal mechanisms fail, then external mechanisms come into play. Basically, what it means is if you cannot align the interest of owners and managers through internal mechanism, then the performance of the company suffers, the company loses its value in the market, and someone may come in and take over your company, trying to restructure it, trying to realign the interests of the people who manage it, and then the new owners. So this is sort of this last resort kind of deal. And it's going to help the company in the future, but you're not going to be the one as the owner to benefit from those improvements. So where do those problems come from? Where does this need to align interests of managers and shareholders originate? So it is a so-called agency problem. And you may have heard it in some of your other classes, maybe yes, maybe no. So I'll give you a brief description of what it is. So as I said, as the company grows, you start augmenting the managerial pool. You start hiring people who manage the company on your behalf. And the problematic thing here is that as a manager, you cannot really manage too many people effectively. So the rule of thumb basically is that you can manage 7 people without too many issues, possibly up to 10. Beyond that, it is very hard to really stay on top, to know what everybody else is doing, to give direction, to keep track of what's going on. It simply increases your mental capacity. And as organizations start growing, you put more and more managers in charge. So the layers of management start piling up, and the whole situation becomes sort of tricky to control. And in that case, when we have the owners, we call them the principals, just exist somewhere out there. And then we have managers who manage the companies on their behalf. We call those managers agents, right? They are agents in charge of managing the company to the owner's interest. And their goal typically is to maximize owner's wealth. So they do everything to increase shareholders' wealth. At least that's the idea. Of course, right now, we also talk about the responsibility to stakeholders, not just to stockholders. And there is all this talk about corporate social responsibility that may sort of eat into profits that otherwise would belong to stockholders. But fundamentally, in the most economic sense, if you are a manager, if you're hiring to manage the company, you hired in order for shareholders to maximize their wealth, right? So whatever it is that you do, you have to ensure that the company runs effectively, that there is no waste, that there is no excess of any kind. So that's that. And this agency problems stems from 3 particular reasons. One is opportunism, also known as self-interest seeking with guile. What it basically implies is that whenever managers have any authority, have any power within an organization, there is this temptation for them to improve their own wealth, right? So it does not necessarily have to be just paying themselves huge salaries. It could be using corporate resources for goals that actually detract from company's value, but enrich them and their families. So you could easily imagine a top manager of the firm hiring, his wife for some really fake made up position where she doesn't do anything of value for the company, but draws compensation. Or maybe somehow supporting kids, maybe paying for their college under some pretense, or maybe, having a company sponsored car that drives them supposedly, to the work and maybe to different meetings, but also drives their kids and their wives and like all of that stuff. And of course, then we can talk about corporate jets that would fly them wherever. So the kind of executive excess that improves the compensation, the level of life of managers, while not necessarily creating extra value for the shareholders. So this is opportunism. The other big problem associated with agency is the so-called shirking. This is when you can't really tell for sure if what they do is meant to improve your welfare. So, you walk into the boardroom, there are all those people sitting there and trying to make a decision, some strategic decision. You have no idea what they really have in mind. Or think about a scientist, right? So you walk into the lab, and let's say you're interested in some innovation, you try to come up with a new product, and there's a guy in a white coat just sitting there at the chair, staring at his computer. There is no way for you to verify whether or not that person actually is thinking about the innovation that will improve your company performance, or if the guy is planning out his next vacation, right? So there is no way to simply verify what your people are doing. And when there is no people to verify what you do, people tend to slack, right? They tend to do anything else other than what they're supposed to. They have their personal lives, they could be calling their friends, they could be solving their personal issues on their paid time. So in some ways, whenever there are complex tasks that are unverifiable, there's always going to be this problem of shirking. And then finally, the really big deal is a holdup, right? Or renegotiation. So you start a particular project and you invest some of your corporate resources into doing something that will supposedly, increase shareholder welfare. And somewhere down the road, you realize that it will take more resources than you anticipated. But because you've already invested so much, you cannot just let it go, because that will be to admit that you've been, duped by your managers, or that you did not verify all the details of this investment project before you committed your company to pursuing that project. And so it starts costing you a lot more. In Japan, there's this tendency for big companies to ask their smaller partners to make transaction-specific investments. Let me give you an example. Let's say you are a Toyota company, so you build cars, and you came up with a new design of a particular part, and you have a partner corporation that does that. And you give them new specifications, and you ask them to build new facilities that will only enable them to make this one part. You are not necessarily willing to guarantee them in writing that you'll be buying this much of this new part at such and such price. So if they start their construction and they've invested, I don't know, several $1 million into the process, and maybe half a year went into the development of this new facility, and then you go back to them and say, oh, by the way, we won't be able to pay you as much as we promised initially for that part, because the market has changed, the conditions have changed, we're only going to pay you 80%. That's it, right? This is a hold-up situation, and you can renegotiate with them how much you're going to pay because they have committed. There is no easy way for them to pull out of this deal. The same thing, and specifically in Japan, they are actually quite nice people. So they don't do that often. If there is an agreement, if there is an understanding between the parties, they're going to follow through and they're going to stick to the original plans. But in many other circumstances, hold up is a major issue, right? So as the owner, you should be very concerned about getting into situations that may position you where agreed upon deals would have to be renegotiated. And this is something you need to deal with. And so because of that, whenever you have those agency problems, you have to incur costs to address them. So what can you possibly do to minimize, to limit, or maybe to even eliminate agency problems? Number one is, well, monitoring. You have to monitor what your employees are doing. If you are, the owner of a big company, maybe you're going to hire some auditing company to make sure that people who work for you do not abuse their authority that you have given them. And this is a sensible approach. If they know they're being watched, even the whole idea of, this knowledge being around, them knowing they're being watched, will curb some of their attempts at misbehaving. But it doesn't come cheap, and it definitely doesn't come free. So you're going to have to pay to those people who would be doing monitoring functions. Even if you are not hiring external parties to do the monitoring, even if you put people inside your company at monitoring tasks, you would still be paying them on a monthly basis or annual basis or one-off basis, whatever the case might be. These are still the resources that could have been spent elsewhere. So this becomes a part of the agency cost. There's also this attempt to provide good incentives to ensure that hired managers do what's best for the company. You all have probably heard about option stock. Right? So this is when the top management of a company, they receive the right, but not the obligation, just the right to buy company stock at a certain pre-specified price after, let's say, a year of running the company. So if they run the company the right way, the stock value goes up. So when they buy those shares at a pre-specified price, if the company value went up, then they have this benefit to gain. If they didn't run the company right, if the company lost value, there is nothing for them to get from this stock option. Again, this is a good idea, right? It ensures that what they do leads to the betterment of your financial outcome as a shareholder, but it forces you to pay more to those people. So it becomes kind of a cost. If you have found some misbehavior and you need to hold those responsible for misbehavior accountable, you take them to the court. Courts are not free. They are not cheap. It's going to cost you, in many cases, millions of dollars to follow through. So that again becomes a cost, the agency cost. And then finally, even when you account for all of that, the incentives, monitoring, enforcement costs, there is still some residual loss associated with having others to run your company. And there are many contexts where agency applies, so it's not just when it's owners and managers, but again, the relationship between the companies, especially with this hold up and renegotiation situation, shirking when you cannot verify what people are doing, opportunism, people going after a specific, typically short-term thing when they have a chance. So these problems are quite prominent across the board. So many situations where this thinking applies. And so corporate governance mechanisms are meant to address agency costs and agency problems. There are three things I would like to highlight here. First is the so-called government policies on governance. So apparently, it's not just the decision maker at the level of companies who are concerned about the misbehavior of individual managers. It's also the government that tries to develop policies that help companies avoid those problems. I don't know if you guys necessarily have heard, we had a bunch of corporate scandals in the US back in late 90s and early 2000s. So one of them was the company called Enron. And I know when I just came to the States, I was completely surprised by what was going on. So for the longest while, Enron was considered a very successful company. They were growing fast. They operate in the energy market. And, they seem to have a fairly sophisticated system that allowed them to outperform the rest of the competition in that specific industry space. It turns out, and of course, as a public company, they had this auditor who would look at their reports every year and certify that everything is correct. And their auditor was one of those big four companies, back then big five. So back then there was this Arthur Andersen. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe not. So those big auditing companies, Ernst & Young, KPMG, Arthur Andersen back then, and others. So it turns out that Enron, in addition to using Arthur Andersen as an auditor, also hired them as consultants. And as consultants, they worked with company management, and they realized that there were some deals that Enron engaged in that were costing shareholders money. And if the information about those losses became public, obviously the market will punish the company and the shareholders would lose some of their value. So they have devised a scheme to disguise some of those losses as partnerships of sorts, right? So you invest this money into a partnership and there is some fake valuation on the partnership. So it appears not as a loss, but rather as an investment. And so on the one hand, Arthur Andersen was advising Enron how to hide those losses. On the other hand, as the auditor, it was looking at Enron's books and saying, well, everything looks legit. Everything looks fine. Whatever is there is correct. When the word of it got out, obviously Enron took a major hit. Its reputation, its valuation, all of that. But it also has affected Arthur Andersen, where the company is no more. It no longer exists. So it had to restructure, it had to, and from that point on, all of those auditing companies have been told by the government to set their consulting divisions as separate independent companies. They can no longer combine consulting services with auditing services to avoid this kind of conflict of interest. And that has become a de facto policy. So the government tries its best to avoid situations where shareholders may incur losses because of something that management does. The other thing that the government necessitates or requires is for companies to use compensation consultants when setting compensation for their top level management. So obviously, CEOs and people at the very top organization, they do make a lot of money. So in many cases, we may talk about tens of millions of dollars each year, which is very substantial, which can limit the benefits that shareholders get from the operations. So to avoid this arbitrary setting of the CEO's compensation, they say, well, you've got to use compensation consultants. You just have to, there's no other way. And supposedly relying on compensation consultants keeps the compensation at check. It allows the companies to avoid overpaying. Again, this is more of a desire than the reality. And I think I gave you this example when I talked about executive access, how companies are, well, they favor some consultants and not others, especially consultants who are known to provide higher, to recommend higher compensation for CEOs. So, despite all the great intentions by the government, companies still find way around those recommendations to embezzle the money away from shareholders and to enrich people, the hired guns, so to speak, who supposedly run companies for the benefit of those who own them. And so for that reason, in addition to those government policies, companies employ specific mechanisms of corporate governance to address this problem. And so the three mechanisms we're going to look at now are known as internal mechanisms of corporate governance, and they are ownership concentration, boards, and executive compensation. So executive compensation, we kind of just touched on before. The idea here is that you want to set the compensation in such a way that CEOs and others are paid for doing the right thing. So, typically the compensation of the top level management, it's not just one number. This is how much you're going to make per year. There is some set component. There is also this incentive component. So you say that, well, I don't know if you guys are following Tesla. In Tesla's case, the shareholders' agreement with Elon Musk was that if the company sells so many vehicles, let's say in a year, then he gets a bump of, so many shares of Tesla, or maybe so much money. If the company valuation reaches a certain threshold, then he gets a bonus of sorts, right? So it is meant to align the interests of a CEO with the ultimate interests of shareholders. So that's this internal mechanism of corporate control that companies rely on to make sure there is no misbehavior, that whatever the CEO does leads to the ultimate betterment of financial outcomes for shareholders. Companies also try to look at ownership concentration. So it turns out that if the company has too many owners, right, and no one has a really control and stake in a company, then CEOs do what they want. Then no one is going to slap them on the wrist. No one's going to tell them you cannot do that. Like if you own 0.002% of a company, even if you learn about this shareholder meeting, you're probably not going to attend because your voice means nothing. And when your voice means nothing, why bother? So you basically let the companies and the CEOs do whatever they please. When the ownership is concentrated, when there are parties, typically institutional owners, right? So pension funds, investment funds that own a big chunk of a corporation, they have a say with respect to what happens. And the level at which this starts is typically believed to be 5%. If you own 5% or more of the company's stock, which makes you a large block shareholder, then you do have the power to affect what kind of decisions are made, what kind of decisions are avoided, and basically how people in charge run the company. In extreme cases, if they don't do what they're supposed to be doing, you can use your power, you can use your equity in a business to try to replace them. And that is enough of a threat for companies, for managers to behave differently. There's been tons and tons of research that looks at this issue specifically across different contexts. In the US, in Europe, Asia, everywhere it's the same. When you have those large block shareholders, managers know to behave because they know their position, their personal position is at risk. They know they're being watched a lot more carefully, because people who know they can affect what's going on in the company, they have the reason to be watching you. And because they're large block shareholders, they're fairly wealthy, they can also hire the expertise to analyze what you do, to make sense of how you run the company. And this is essential, right? So keep that in mind. And then finally, there are boards, board of directors and advisory boards. Um, and typically what happens here is, especially for companies that have many shareholders, they realize that it is not practical for all of them to monitor the activities of top management team of the organization. So they hire some people to monitor top managers on their behalf. So as a shareholder, you vote to choose certain people, to elect certain people onto the board. And those people then would be responsible for monitoring the activity of the CEO and maybe VPs and all those other people they would be having say as to what strategy is being followed. They will be having a say in how CEOs are compensated. So basically, board of director members, they do what shareholders should on behalf of shareholders to try to keep top level managers under control, try to ensure that what they do is ultimately consistent with long-term interests of shareholders. It does not really solve the agency problem, right? Because in a way, these directors themselves, board of director members, they also are becoming agents on behalf of owners. But at least it gives a more or less agile mechanism to curb self-interest seeking behavior of the CEO and top management team members, and help out shareholders, not miss out on opportunities and not overpay and all of that. We'll talk about boards in a few minutes in more detail. But so these were boards of directors. They typically have some real power to appoint people, to maybe fire the CEO, to recommend strategies, to recommend compensation. So they are quite powerful. There are also different kind of boards known as advisory boards. And this is typically the board that serves supplementary function. So they do not have the authority to decide, but they have the authority to recommend. So they may recommend who will be a member of the board of directors. They may recommend certain policies to be considered. So they are like a high power, high status, high quality advisors to those boards of directors. And this is not the most typical arrangement. So elsewhere in the world, most organizations have just board of directors, so one-tier board. There are some countries where it is customary having two-tiered boards, so the board of directors and advisory boards. And there are some companies that allow for both kind of boards, Switzerland being one example. And those companies, looking at those companies allows us to actually see whether or not having this advisory board makes any sense, if it could improve the managerial outcomes or firm outcomes and enrich shareholders. So that's that. Now, so those are the internal mechanisms. If they fail to ensure that managers do what's in the best interest of shareholders, the outcome typically is a loss of value by the firm in the stock exchange. So if you're a publicly traded company, your stock plummets, right? So your valuation goes down to the point where someone else from the outside may recognize that they may take you over, restructure, restore the value, and then capture that value for their own shareholders. Right? So this is, when we talked about diversification, I think I mentioned the example of a company called Tyco that was known for taking over companies that, in their words, were fat, dumb, and happy. So those were the companies that were not run effectively. Those were the companies where managers were allowed to abuse their authority and power. As a result, the company valuation went down. Those acquiring companies, or Tyco in that instance, came in and took them over, restructured them, turned them around, made a lot of money in the process, and sort of lived happily ever after. So that's the idea, right? So there is this market for corporate control for publicly traded companies that allows an external party to come in, take you over, restructure, improve your performance if your current managers do not do their job properly. Make sense? So again, it's not going to help the current shareholders, because once the company is taken over, they basically, they're out of business. But it's going to help the company itself. So it may seem to be a solution to those agency problems and agency costs, but it's only in some peculiar sense that this is a solution. Because in reality, the shareholders, if they couldn't control their managers well, then they are out of business. Now, looking at the board of directors, the big question is, how are you going to make them more effective? And there are several factors to consider. Question number one is, who do you want to see on the board of directors? There are three categories of individuals that could be on the board: insiders, outsiders, and related outsiders. So insiders obviously refers to people who are employed by the company. So let's say your CFO, Chief Financial Officer, may also be a member of the board. And so you know that as a board member, he or she can inform other board members of what's going on financially and help maybe address whatever questions they have, and that's that. And many companies have boards that are dominated by insiders. A very peculiar case of those insiders on a board is the situations known as CEO duality. So this is when the person who is the CEO of the company is at the same time a chairman of the board of directors. And it would seem like it completely defeats and defies the logic, right? If board of directors is meant to monitor, to control top managers of the organization, how can you possibly put the same guy whose activities you're supposed to monitor in charge of board of directors? Yet it happens left and right. It happens very often. So the big question is why? And supposedly because the board is mainly in charge of strategizing, making those big strategic decisions that are going to affect the company for a number of years, long term. Whereas the typical top managers, they are more, they operate more at the tactical level. And by having the CEO also chair the board of directors, you enable some sort of continuity between strategies and tactics. And then everybody is equally well informed, and that's that. The literature is not exactly in agreement on whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. There are many instances where it does seem to help, where it's a good idea to have the CEO to also chair the board. In many cases, in many other cases, it definitely eases the misbehavior on the part of the CEO because he is charged effectively with controlling himself. So that may seem illogical. The other big question is, how big would you like for the board to be? And here you need to ask yourself, what kind of role does the board play? So other than monitoring the decision makers at the level of the company, what else does the board do? And a very important part of their functions, of the board's functions, is sort of addressing resource limitations of the company. Because typically no company has all the resources it needs. It doesn't have connections across different sectors. It may not have an easy way to reach certain customers in some industries. So by having a larger board, you improve your chances of getting access to resources that are critical to your success. It could be physical resources. It can be information, which is probably more important. It can be maybe knowledge of different tactics that have been tried in different companies and different industries that you may then transplant into your own company. So there are definitely reasons to believe that larger boards are beneficial. At the same time, if you try to manage too many people at once, that beyond certain threshold, it really becomes more of a burden than it is help. So if you have too many people and everybody needs to talk or wants to talk, it takes forever to discuss things. It is much harder to agree on anything. And you also have the phenomenon known as groupthink. So what groupthink really is that when a group is large and people, it's hard for them to agree on anything, they tend to find not the optimal solution to a problem, but the most simplistic solution, sort of the least effective solution that seems to check all the boxes. So rather than finding this optimal solution or optimizing, they are satisficing. That is, they are trying to find any solution that will satisfy like all the requirements, even though better solution may be available. So the larger the board, the harder it is for the board to reach a solution that would actually be optimal. They will settle for something less. And for that reason, it turns out that you want to have a board that is neither too small nor too large. So, the golden mean, the optimal level, the optimal size is somewhere in the middle. And boards of directors are often criticized. It turns out that they tend to approve managers' self-sovereign initiatives too readily. They do not subject proposed initiatives to scrutiny. They did not analyze everything. So they tend to buy what managers suggest at face value. And in this sense, board of directors are not good agents themselves on behalf of shareholders. Right? They have to exercise their judgment. They have to be effective monitors, and they are not. They are also exploited by managers with personal ties to board members. So even if the board is typically, sort of independent, the people who are on the board do not have formal connections to, employees, to top managers. It could be that as a top manager of the organization, you have a history of prior relationships with some of the board members, your friends, or maybe your business partners. And if that's the case, they will be more likely to support whatever initiative is of interest to you. So, managers can exploit those personal ties to board members, which will be detrimental for the shareholders' benefits. So that's a criticism of boards of directors. They may not be too vigilant in hiring and monitoring CEO behavior. If the CEO is good, it's not that complicated for him or her to conceal what it is that they actually, try to accomplish. And because you are not really working for the company full time as a, board of director member, you kind of look at what they do, but you don't overanalyze it necessarily. So there are many things that you can miss, and boards are criticized for that. And there are all those arguments about the board size that I talked about, the insiders versus outsiders, and like what do you do and how do you pay to board members? Do you compensate them? Do you not? If you do, how exactly are you going to do it? Do you need to provide incentives for them to monitor activities of top managers in a particular way? And if so, how do you do that exactly? So, everybody seems to be using boards. It is demanded by the government in many cases, but to this day, there are many disagreements as to, what the effective board is going to look like. And over the years, certain trends have developed that we need to recognize and that have implications for, structure and an effective organization. First of all, boards of directors are becoming smaller. It used to be that companies could have, 30 directors on the board, 50 directors, with the idea being that, they will bring in the valuable information, they will connect us to key players, so the more the merrier. Companies have now realized that this is actually a very bad idea, so boards are becoming smaller. Boards are also becoming more independent. So companies have realized that owners rather, have recognized that you cannot really expect, those insiders as directors to monitor themselves. Like I'm saying this to you, and it seems kind of logical, and it's really surprising that companies took a long while to realize that, but this is the case, right? So boards tend to become more independent. They include more outside members, and this provides stronger incentives for them to monitor, less opportunity for insiders, for CEOs and others to influence board decisions. So this helps. Investors are becoming more active, especially those large block shareholders. They are no longer content with, just letting the company run itself. They actually keep close track at what the company is doing. They're not afraid to speak up. If they are not happy, they will go out of the way to try to replace those misbehaving CEOs. So that is essential. And as businesses become more globalized, a lot of them do expand to other countries. There are all those country differences, and in many instances, the shareholders' right, the infrastructure, the institutional environment is not quite as developed as in some of the more developed nations. So there are all those back and forth motions across countries, between countries. How do you structure that? So there's no one ready answer for the best way to do it. But a lot of even developing economies try to structure their institutional environment and those policies related to governance. They try to model it after those more established countries, economies, and societies. So this is something to just keep in mind. Now, I will probably not go into that. So I told you previously that when we discussed strategic alliances and cooperative strategies, that there is this new approach to structuring organizations, especially in the Northern Europe, those networks of small and medium-sized companies. And, those same issues that apply to corporate governance within individual firms also apply to networks of firms. And so I want to tell you a little bit about what research has uncovered about trying to manage those networks of independent companies effectively. So it turns out that just like with regular corporations, in networks, you also want to pay your directors, right? So you have to compensate them to ensure they work diligently. May seem like a very obvious thing, but companies until recently didn't know how to do it. So now we tell them that based on everything we know, based on all the information we've collected, you got to pay them to make sure they are interested in working in the best interest of shareholders. So that is very essential. And the plot that you see here shows you basically that the more you pay, the higher the performance. So this is almost like a linear relationship there. So that is important. With respect to board independence, you want to avoid both extremes. You don't want to be, for your board to be completely made up of insiders, right? People who hold positions within the organization, because then they are not very likely to monitor themselves very effectively. And if they are insiders, they do not bring in new perspectives, fresh opportunities to the organization to consider. If the board is made up of mostly outsiders, so it's independent, that may seem like a good thing, right? So those people, they are not afraid to monitor the internal managers. They are also fairly well connected to outside opportunities. They may share information. They may, introduce you to the key players. But it turns out that this is not good either, because these people, they lack the deep knowledge of your industry, of your company. So a lot of advice that they may offer is actually irrelevant. So it turns out that there is this golden mean, right? So this is the medium level of independence that is most conducive to high performance of organizations. So you want there to be some dependent members, so some insiders and some outsiders. And how many of which actually depends on a lot of other things, but the general principle remains the same. So you want this independence to not be too high or too low. The same with board size. If you have too few members, then there's not really much they can do, right? All those new perspectives are limited. If there's too many of them, yes, they bring in a lot of new information. They can introduce you to all those other players, but it's hard to manage them effectively. So again, just like with independence, you want there to be some golden mean. And then that's a good piece of advice as well. So how do you structure an effective board? Again, keep it concise in terms of the size. What you want to do is you want to increase diversity of backgrounds. So when we talk about diversity, there are different ways of looking at it, right? We may look at it from, the gender perspective, the male-female representation. We may look at it from the functional background diversity perspective. You have to have some people who know engineering, finance, marketing, and whatnot. It turns out that for those boards to perform best, they have to be as diverse as possible in terms of functional backgrounds, gender, and whatnot, age. But at the same time, there's got to be something that unifies them together, that brings them together, that makes sure they actually are on the same page, that they trust each other, they share something among themselves so they can function as an effective group. And what you see often in companies that operate quite effectively is they will have very diverse boards in terms of functional backgrounds, industry experience, gender, age, But all of those people, or most of those people, went to the same university, for instance. So even though functionally or in any other ways they are diverse, there is this overarching identity that they all share. So diversity is good, but some homogeneity in some respect that allows them to function as a well-oiled machine is necessary if you want to see your board being effective. So you definitely want to strengthen internal management and accounting control system. You want to establish procedures to evaluate board performance, which is quite interesting, right? So the board is there to evaluate top managers, but they themselves have to be monitored. And how you do that is a big question. So you may bring third parties, external consultants, external organizations to do it. You may compare your boards to boards at similar companies and try to make a determination as to which one was better. But this is a challenge. It's like a never-ending cycle. Because if you institute yet another board to monitor your main board, then who's going to monitor those? And for that reason, a lot of what we talk about, we can never really test because it's like a loop that never ends. You typically want to have some lead directors, so some members of the board of directors in charge of a particular question. So people have clear-cut responsibilities, because when they know that this is on them, they will definitely put a lot more effort into it. So that is essential. And ideal board of director would be an outside director who is engaged but non-executive, so he would not make, or she wouldn't have, a chance to be making really binding decisions on the part of the corporation, but would be really engaged, right? Will provide the expertise, will provide insights, share insights, and all of that, and not just sit there as a placeholder. Would be challenging but supportive, and independent but involved. So they kind of coalesce around the same set of values, and that's again in many cases easier said than done. We understand what a good board member looks like, but where we find them, how we train them, how we bring them on, how we compensate them, those all remain open questions. And now, if we fail to engage these internal mechanisms for corporate control effectively, the outcome is that managers basically do whatever they want, not in the interest of shareholders, but in their own interest. And when that happens, markets do notice that, and the valuation of your company goes down. So even though you may have great assets, the market does not value you high enough, which means now it's a time for the external mechanism for corporate control to kick in. So an external party may come in and take you over in a hostile fashion, kick out the old managers who did not run the company effectively, put the new people in place, and turn the company around. And when that happens, the markets will recognize that, wow, now the company is run a lot more effectively. So the valuation will go up, which will enable that acquiring company to realize the profit, the benefits that it has generated through this takeover. And it seems to be that, the whole, just the very idea of there possibly being a hostile takeover provides enough incentive for many companies, for many managers to not misbehave too badly. Like they know that if they run their company poorly, someone will come, they take them over, boot them out of the company, basically tarnish the reputation so they become unemployable in the future, and that's that. And for that reason, some managers, unfortunately, rather than choosing to run their companies better, they choose to institute those managerial defense tactics. So this is something where they make it harder for external parties to take over their failing companies. So they would do anything that will increase the cost of a takeover. They will try to make their company less attractive as a takeover target. And there are many different mechanisms they can involve, and I'll talk about many of them in just a couple of minutes. But in a way, because all those mechanisms are made to make the company less attractive, this is actually a further burden on current shareholders to allow managers to have those defense tactics. So let's talk about some of those defense tactics that are known to exist. So one, and this is a well-known one, is so-called poison pill. Yeah, they do have those funny names, but I mean, what can you do? So what is a poison pill? A poison pill is a provision in a charter of a company that allows current shareholders to buy more stock at a very low price in case of a takeover, of a hostile takeover. So if you're a company shareholder and someone tries to take over your company, and let's say they buy 50% of stock, you can actually release more stock, and your current shareholders will have a preferential right of buying it with a huge discount, which means the share of equity controlled by the acquiring firm will be diluted. So they will spend all that money hoping to control 50% of the company, whereas in fact, after poison pill has been put in place, they would only control 20%. So that makes this entire takeover attempt illogical, not important, and sort of a questionable investment. So they probably would not do that. You as a shareholder are not necessarily helped, but at least, if nothing else, you get to keep control over that company. So that's one. Golden parachute. This is something that is very funny, actually, that companies use that and shareholders approve it. So golden parachute is a provision that compensates top-level managers very mightily in the case of hostile takeover. So there is this provision in the charter of a company that says, if there's ever a hostile takeover against the company, then the CEO gets, 10 years worth of compensation at once. So here we talk about, potentially millions and millions of dollars that the company will pay to their managers. And supposedly, because those expenses are so high, acquiring companies will be discouraged from taking over this failing company. Again, the only individuals to benefit from it is not the shareholders, but the corrupt managers, so to speak, or those misbehaving, misperforming managers. But it does serve to prevent other companies from taking you over because, they will, effectively as new owners, they will have to pay for the old managers' golden parachutes. Green mail is when, acquiring company instead offers more money, even more money to the acquiring company. So they kind of, rather than being acquired, they sort of pay off their acquirers. And a questionable tactic, and it usually leads to the company taking on a lot of debt, which reduces its effectiveness. So, maybe in some cases it works. Capital restructuring. So companies realize that others want to take them over because they have some valuable assets. So they may sell off those assets to third parties just not to be of interest to potential acquirers, or they will take on a lot of debt so that the new company who is about to acquire them realizes that, wait a minute, if we take them over, we will be responsible for the debt. So like their attractiveness falls. So like there are all those other mechanisms, and I would actually encourage you to read more about them. Your textbook has information, and there's a lot on the web. Many of them are quite effective. So that's that. And some of the international issues here in corporate governance, I told you that in some countries, there is not just one kind of board of directors, but two boards, board of directors and board of advisors. So the big question is, which one is more effective? And the US and the UK typically has a one-tier board. In the States, the CEO is fairly often also the chairman of the board. So this ultimate control is in just one hands. In the UK, those are typically disjointed responsibilities. So typically two individuals. And the evidence is really inconclusive as to which strategy is better. Germany, on the other hand, has two-tier boards, right? So they have board of directors and advisory board. Advisory board will recommend who gets on board of directors, and they also give some other advice. And those companies, again, seem to be doing fine. In Switzerland, they have those two kind of boards coexisting. So it's possible to see under which condition each becomes more effective. Again, there is nothing that we've learned so far that would tell us for sure you have to do this or you have to do that, which basically leads to just one conclusion. Even though boards do have a role, that role is not that significant. Right? So once the separation of ownership and management occurs, there's got to be some inefficiencies. And like everything depends on everything else. So, what you can do is a big question. And Japan and South Korea, there are very different structures. So those kind of guys, they favor like super large companies, chaebols in South Korea, Kiretsu in Japan. Like mega corporations that operate across many industries. We would probably call them conglomerates in the West, but unlike conglomerates in the West, these guys are actually quite effective. And so again, like a lot of the things that we think we know about corporate governance and management in situations like that turns out to be not true, right? So, which means for you guys, there are many opportunities to make your own mark and maybe come up with mechanisms, corporate governance mechanisms that will enable your companies to run as effectively and as smoothly as possible. And so with that, I'm going to end the lecture. If you have any questions, now is the time to ask. So I'll wait maybe 30 seconds to see if there's any hands here. And if not, then thank you for being here, and I'll see you next week. Take care, guys.